the next few minutes. But like I said, I'm going to get us started as close to 6 as we can. And we're really thanking the Lord today that he brought Brother Bruce here with his 24-hour trip to go from, was it Indiana? Or Michigan to, right. But he is here in the flesh, and we are thankful. And we're having our creation seminar. And so I'm going to go ahead and open in prayer and then turn it over to Bruce here. So let's join me in prayer. Father, we're thankful for your blessings. Lord, thank you for getting Brother Bruce here, Lord, and safely. And we ask that you would bless him tonight. Use him, Lord, to teach and to encourage us and build us up in our faith. Lord, we recognize you as our creator. Lord, we know there's so much to learn, and we desire that. We come hungry and thirsting for knowledge about you as our creator. So bless everybody that's here and those that will be coming tonight, and we ask this in Jesus' name, amen. All right, thank you, Brother Bruce, if you'd come.
Off sermon. 4 years ago I was here, if you all remember. And when I was here last time, I spoke on Mount St. Helens. I did a talk on how the world around us, brilliant people, scientists and teachers and universities and textbooks, they can all be blind to what God says is so obvious that it couldn't have made itself. And we'll continue that theme this week. I really wanted to lay the groundwork last time of the worldwide flood was this key moment in all of human and earth history. And when you leave that out, you're going to misinterpret everything. You're going to misinterpret the rocks and the fossils and the layers and the time frame and when death entered into creation. Everything. You're going to get it all wrong if you leave the flood out. And I call that how to fold a rock, because we see all these folded sediment in every mountain. And rocks break when you bend them. They don't fold unless they're like mud. So all the mountains, the Rockies and the Alps and all those mountains were pushed up at the end of Noah's flood while those layers were soft. Then I did a talk about the brilliance of ancient mankind and how all these civilizations just appeared. The Egyptians and the Incas and the Chinese and the Mesopotamians, they were just brilliant people right at the very beginning, because Noah would have brought lots of knowledge with him from 1,500 years. Think of what you could learn if you lived for 800-900 years. Man, you could become this phenomenal artist, and then a phenomenal scientist, and then a phenomenal engineer, and then a phenomenal literary person. It's like hundreds of years after hundreds of years to learn things. Lots and lots of that came through to those early civilizations. And last, I talked about all these things we can discover from creation. So I've got 4 completely new talks that you haven't heard tonight for the next 4 evenings, and I think you'll enjoy them. I've rearranged things. The talk I was going to do last, because I missed the sermon, is a great overview of the majesty of God, and I want to start with that tonight. So we're going to talk about. Gotta turn this on. Okay, I'm going to need to change batteries in my clicker, so we'll do it that way. Huh. No, wait a second. It just seems to be locked up. I don't know what's going on. Okay, we're going to talk about the awe of God. Now, whenever I go and I talk, and I speak about 40 times a year, 2 to 3 times a month, I'm in a different church or youth group or school or whatever. People always come up afterwards, and they're really kind of heartbroken, because they'll talk about their kids and their grandkids and their neighbors and their friends and their coworkers, and they have no interest in God, no interest in coming to church, no interest in discussing anything the Bible has to say. Matter of fact, there's kind of growing aversion to talking about things the Bible has to say in our culture around us. Now, I suspect this is kind of a conservative little community, and that's not necessarily as prevalent. But I'm telling you, across America, it is very, very prevalent. And I kind of am an engineer. That's what I do. I figured out how things work, and you figure out how the world science works and use it to modify and change and invent things. And I worked almost 30 years as a research leader for Dow Chemical. So I think about these things. It's like, why aren't people more interested in God and what he's done? Because we live in a time where there is more access to the Bible and more really good, solid teaching about the truths of the Bible, and more ability to see and hear and read these things than any time in human history. And yet we're reaching a point in human history where there's less and less and less people that have any interest in it. And I think a big part of it, it's twofold, is it's trained out of people's thinking. The entire the viewpoint that everything made itself owns the education system. It owns the media system and the movies, and evolution pops up in the millions of years, which is hand in hand with the whole concept of evolution. In the museums and most of the internet sites, they only present that viewpoint. So it kind of removes God from the picture, and everything just developed and modified and adapted and made itself. And it's so prevalent in people's thinking. So they lose the awe of who God is and what he did. And second, that's one big aspect. And that's the one that we can do the most about. And second, life just beats us up because we live in a fallen world. And nothing's ever going to be perfect in this world. People are going to lie to you. They're going to lie about you. Young children are going to die for no good reason. There's going to be tragedies. There's going to be divorces. There's going to be issues. There's going to be financial pressure. And it's everywhere around us in life. And it's going to happen. Nobody's going to go through this life without lots of problems. Jesus said, you will have tribulation in this life. There's no stopping it. It's going to happen, and it's going to hurt. And it kind of beats you up. And you just kind of lose this focus on God and who he is. So I want to spend the next hour, and by the way, the program every evening, and I hope you can come to as many as possible. Each one's different. They don't build one upon another. They're different topics. Will be the first hour or so, and I often go a little bit over because the more familiar I am with folks, and it's my second time here, the more I tend to go different directions. And nothing I do is scripted. I'll just follow my slides and kind of speak as I feel like the Lord would want me to. In the last 15 minutes or more, we'll do questions. If you don't have questions, we'll break early. So that'll be the schedule each night. But I want to start with a story as we're thinking about the awe of God. And then I'm going to start somewhere I don't normally start when I've done these talks. And this, I've only given this talk about 2 other times. But I want to start with kind of a parable. And I'm going to take you, we'll just do it manually to figure out what's going on. If you look at the things God has made, those beautiful animals, we're going to talk about some of these phenomenal creatures God made tonight. And not the typical giraffes, elephants, lions, and bears, oh my, but the little cool things that provide teaching moments to help the people around us understand there's no possible explanation for these things other than that God literally made them with incredible foresight and genius. And by looking at them and looking at some of the things they can do and their characteristics, you can know that this is true. But God's the great artist. And you can look at creation, and that's his template on which he created beauty beyond imagination. But one of the greatest human artists is a man named Michelangelo. He's considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest, human artist that ever lived. Lived in the 1500s, and later in his life, the Pope, who kind of ruled the religious world in Europe, he said, I am building this chapel to the glory of God, and I want the greatest artist who has ever lived to paint the ceiling of this chapel. It's called the Sistine Chapel. And I want it to be covered with pictures, big, huge panels, like 10-foot by 20-foot areas of Bible stories. And he told Michelangelo, you need to do this. Now, at this point in Michelangelo's life, he wanted to do sculpture. He'd spent his 20, 30 years doing paintings, but he just had this love of creating these gorgeous statues. And that's what he wanted to do, but you don't turn down the Pope, so he just had to do it. And for the next 3 years, hour after hour, day after day, week after week, month after month, he laid on his back, mixing paint with plaster and creating these gorgeous pictures on the ceiling on a scaffold. Now, I want you to imagine that you are the child of Michelangelo, okay? He's your daddy. And you're in your teenage years and you're saying, Dad, let's play ball. Say, nah, I gotta paint the ceiling. I wanna get this project done. I can't. Come on, Dad, you gonna be home for supper tonight? No, I can't. I gotta get this done. I won't be home again tonight. I'm just running late. I'm behind schedule. And like for a big part of your childhood years, your dad just doesn't have time for you. He's too busy painting this picture on the ceiling. Panel after panel after panel of Bible scenes. Well, by this point you grow up and you're off apprenticing in some career and you're kind of irritated at Dad and all the time that it was spent that he could have been doing stuff with you. And eventually your father dies and then you're getting old and like 40 years later you decide, I want to go see it again. I want to go see this ceiling that my father spent all this time as his crowning achievement of art. So you join a tour group, you come back to Rome, and you follow this group of people in, and the tour guide comes through the door, and you're looking up this ceiling, and he says, this ceiling is a miracle. It's an absolute miracle. You see, rain happened on the roof as it started to leak a few years back. And as the water oozed down through the stones, it picked up different minerals. And the minerals were different colors. And then pictures started to appear on the ceiling. And over time, over weeks and months, different scenes from the Bible started to appear all by themselves in the ceiling. And a year later, there was nothing there before, and all of these beautiful paintings appeared because of this miraculous natural process of the water picking up that paint. And that's how this got here. Now let's go on and see some of the other artwork in the Vatican. Now, what would you think as the son of Michelangelo? How would you feel? Say it really loud. The guide's a nutcase. What else? Any other emotion? Anger. Absolutely. Irritation, disbelief. You would be livid that someone would deny the work and the genius and the talent and the beauty that your father had created because you knew the truth. Now, you know where I'm going with this? That's exactly what's happening all around us. We're the children of God, the living God. We know what he has done. We can't see him, but we can see what he's made. And the world around us is denying it. They're the tour guides. And God said, we're to be the light, we're to be the truth. We've got to get the truth out in front of people because they're being lied to. But they're so conditioned to believe science, well, you got to follow the science. How many times did you hear that during COVID? Follow the science. Science can't do anything. It's a tool like a hammer or a screwdriver. And you can use it to come to any conclusion you want. Evidence can be interpreted lots of different ways. And the people who are promoting this idea that chemicals came alive and the universe made itself and that bacteria turned into fish, that turned into land animals, that turned into monkeys, that turned into people, they're going to sound really authoritative. And they're going to have lots of information that's going to sound like, wow, that makes sense. Just like the idea, well, water can pick up minerals and it will stain a surface. That's evidence. But they leave so much out. And that's the kind of stuff that we're going to teach that you can just have in conversations and share with people. Now, I'm not going to start with Genesis. That's the great creation book. It talks about very specifically when and how and where God made very specific types of creatures. I'm going to go to the second greatest creation book in the Bible because it not only deals with creation, and when you leave creation out, that awe of God starts to disappear. It also deals with that second problem, which is the fallen nature of this creation. And that is the book of Job. Now, Job is considered the oldest, written book of the Bible. Genesis describes things that happened at the very beginning of creation, and it moves on from there. But it was penned by Moses, and I believe he wrote it down, but more than likely he was using documents that came from Adam all the way down to Noah. Noah brought him through kind of what he's reporting, what was told to Adam when he was walking in the garden with God. But Job talks about things that happened right after the flood. For instance, it contains incredible scientific insights. I'm just going to back up. It talks about a man who lived to about 200 years old. Abraham lived to about 200 years old. Lifespans were dropping, so it's in that time frame. It has more mentions of ice and snow than any other book in the entire Bible, by far. Ice and snow is mentioned four or five times. Isaiah mentions that our sins be as scarlet, they can be made white as snow, and there's very other few mentions of that. Immediately following the flood, there had to have been an ice age here on earth. As people were spreading out, even as you look at population maps with time, you see all the populations of the early Mesopotamia, Egyptian, Chinese world are all along the equator, and there was nothing going on up in Europe because it was covered with ice in that time. Israel never was, but that's where that was at. So Job was probably written, the flood happened 44-ish hundred years ago. Ice Age started almost immediately as warm ocean waters evaporating at much higher rates and coming down as snow in the north and much more water in the south. Egypt with a lush paradise. There were huge areas of sand and desert immediately after the flood because there was more rainfall worldwide. So see, all this fits. All these things about what things looked like at different ages of human inhabitants fit biblically when you understand the flood was a real event. But the main thing about Job is it's all about pain and suffering. And throughout the book, Job's asking, why is this happening to me? Why is this happening to me? Why is this happening to me? And I'll try to paint a picture of his life in a moment. And last, it provides that ultimate solution and hope to that issue. And people need that. They need that today. But in a way that you wouldn't expect. Now, let me give you a background before I get into these really cool creatures God has made and why I want to go there. Job, we're told, God pointed him out as the man of all humanity of his day. And there were probably hundreds of thousands of people, maybe we're up to millions of people within 300, 400, 500 years of the flood. That's how fast humanity propagates. They probably had very large families. There was no reason they'd have little families. They were still living for hundreds of years after the flood. A lot of genetic mistakes hadn't built up, and lifetimes hadn't dropped off as much as they are today. So God says, look at my servant. He loves me. He obeys me. He's a model of humanity. And Satan said, well, why wouldn't he be? Look at all the blessings you've given him. So God allowed him to be tested. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. God will allow us to be tested. Don't assume because something bad is happening. It's not because God isn't in it. Okay? At the very least, he's allowing it. Job was incredibly rich. This is at the very beginning. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 team of oxen, 500 female donkeys. He had many servants. He was by far the richest man of that entire area. Okay, so this is a rich dude, maybe the richest man on earth. He's the Bill Gates of his day. But he also loves and serves God. It talks about him giving counsel to others, taking care of orphans, doing good deeds. He's a good man, sacrificing, following God's rules. Well, in one day, I get this picture. He loses all of his money. A storm comes and wipes out all of his animals, all his barns, all his buildings. 10 children die instantaneously. Lose all of his. Now, I've seen people go into despair. I saw it with my father. My brother died when he was 19. he went into depression, rejected God, and it lasted for 40 years of his life because of one child dying. The despair, it's unfathomable to lose everything. And then he lost his health. I get the picture that there is no one short of Jesus Christ that suffered the way Job suffered. Every square millimeter of his body was in incredible oozing, breaking out, pus and blood pouring out pain to the point that the only way he could lower his pain level was to take a broken pot and just scrape his body so it would replace the pain that was oozing out from him. And it lasted day after day after day, maybe for weeks or months. We don't have the exact time frame. So physically, mentally, emotionally, intellectually, financially, this man is devastated. Like I think no other human has been tested. So we look at our problems or even the worst we see happening to people, that happened to Job. Okay, and it wasn't just a physical thing. His response, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will be when I leave. The Lord gives what I had. It all came from him. So he has the right to take it away. Praise be the name of the Lord. What a man. Wow. And in all this, he didn't blame God. He didn't sin by just saying, what horrible things you're doing to me. And one of my favorite verses, this is just so cool. In the middle of all this, he makes a statement that I know the one who will come and be the solution to my problems, all of my problems. My Redeemer is the one who will come and solve my sin problems, my emotional problems, my financial problems, all the problems I can think of. He will be standing upon this earth. The promise of Jesus' coming was made way back. This is 2,000 years before Jesus showed up. So there's the background. Now, the biggest test, I think, wasn't even the financial loss, the emotional loss, the relationship loss, the physical pain. He was then tempted through 4 close relationship friends to blame it all on God, basically. That's what they were asking. They were saying, if you would just admit that you haven't performed well enough, then God would make it all okay. In other words, the solution to whatever, our salvation, our problems, or whatever, are just to perform better. That is the lie of Satan from the very beginning. Our solution is our responsibility. If we'll just do things better, if we'll just obey a little better, if we'll just work a little harder, then everything will be okay. Instead of realizing God's the one in charge, not only of our redemption, but of the circumstances of our life. And Job refused to buy it because he knew it was a lie. So he passed the ultimate test. But in the middle of it all, he was in incredible pain. He said, I wish I'd never been born. God, if I'd only never been born. And over again, why are you allowing this? Why am I going through such as this? God never answered that question. This is important. God doesn't always give us the answer. He may never give us the answer. But what did he do in the longest monologue of the creator of the universe to mankind ever recorded in all of Scripture? God just pointed out who he was by what he had made. That's Job chapter 36, 37, 38, 39, 40 for 5 chapters. And he started by saying, Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the very earth? Tell me if you have that understanding. And then he starts with all of the universe and the earth itself is resting upon nothing. And the weather and the patterns and all these scientific insights. Then he starts talking about these incredible animals he'd made. And in the end of it all, after a 4-chapter monologue, where God is describing who he is by what he has made, we can understand God by looking at what he has made. And Romans tells us the same thing. Important stuff you find in the Old Testament, and then you find it repeated in the New Testament. Important stuff God makes crystal clear and repeats them over and over again in terms you can't confuse. In Romans, it says we can know about God and without excuse by observing what he has made, by observing creation. And this is what he did with Job. At the end of all this, Job made this statement. He said, I know that you can do anything. Now, God has spoken to him in a very clear way. And he says, I know, you've shown me what you've done, so I know you can do anything. You could have kept me from getting a disease. You could have kept the weather from destroying everything I own. You could have kept my children from dying, but you didn't. And no one can stop you. I had only heard of you before. See, Job served God because someone had told him about God growing up. And God had revealed things to him. He'd heard about God. But now I have seen you with my own eyes. And in response to knowing who you are by what you've shown me, I'm like dust and ashes. And I repent for ever having had any doubt and dropped into sorrow. Did Job see God during this 4-chapter monologue? Was God just standing there visibly before him? I think there's lots of scripture that says no. We look upon God. We're so sinful. He's so holy. We would just die. So Job didn't see God. What did he see? He saw in a very clear way what God had made. Now, there's really important implications to that. And then here's how it ends. So the Lord blessed Job the second half of his life even more than the beginning. At the end, he gave him 14,000 sheep. How many did he have at the beginning? 7,000. 6,000 camels, twice as many. 1,000 oxen, twice as many. 1,000 female donkeys. He gave him twice as many of everything. And then he gave him 7 more sons and 3 more daughters. So now, does he have twice as many kids? Okay, you guys get it. There are very few churches that get this. Yes, God doubled the number of children. You see, just because you die doesn't mean you no longer exist. That is such an important thing in this world. People think they die and that's it. Then God would have given him 20 children. That would be the same thing as saying, well, those first 10 children, they don't even matter. They don't exist. They're gone. They never were. But they aren't. Our bodies die. Our souls and spirit are going to live forever with God or forever separated from God. And it's right there in this chapter. This is such an important book of the Bible. You see, the lessons there, it's incredible insight into God's character. Pain and suffering is not caused by God, but it's allowed by God, and he will use it. He'll use it to have empathy with others. He'll use it to build our perseverance. He'll use it to build our character. He'll use it to allow us to learn to trust him more. So our first response doesn't necessarily be, God, take it away. It should be, God, what are you trying to teach me? What can I learn? How can I glorify you through this? Trusting God during times of suffering will bring a reward, and it's not going to be easy. Job ends by reminding us that life is not all there is, and we're not just gone when we die. It's right there in that book. And last, it's focusing on who God is, and the only way you can do that is focusing on what he's done through us through salvation, but that's kind of an intangible thing. The other way is to look at what he has made and really understanding, it could never, no little part of it could ever have made itself. That moves us past focusing on ourselves and our problems. So this is an important intro to what I'm about to talk about, the awe of God. So we're going to start with teeny little creature of God, and then we're going to move ourselves up to bigger creatures. Now, I love this because it's ironic. I took this picture 2 years ago. I went to visit my son in Wisconsin. I'm actually, as soon as I get back, I'm home for one day, and then we're going to go visit him again on Friday of next week. But there's corn mazes, and this was called the world's biggest corn maze. I think it's a 30-some acre field. And This year, they carved something different every year. They carved this tiny little creature called a pterograde. It's the smallest animal that God has made that has legs. Now, it's not a microorganism. It's like a little animal, like a dog or a cat, except I want you to hold your two fingers together for it. Okay, this is, okay. Now, try to get your thumb and your forefinger as close as you can without them touching, okay? If they touch, you lose. That's about how big that creature is, okay? Now, when you actually look in water, it's like you don't even see him. He's so small. You almost need a microscope, but he's not microscopic. And he has 8 legs. Now, dogs have 4, and, like insects have a ton, but I think he's the only animal that's not an insect. He's an actual animal that has 8 legs. Now, he's only 0.5 millimeters long, and here's what he looks like. Isn't he cute? He's just so cute. Floats around in water, called a pterograde. Kind of like a little teddy bear. They ought to sell these in toy stores so kids can cuddle up with them at night in their beds. But it kind of sucks in little bits of moss and stuff through that little suction straw thing he has for a nose. Well, scientists, I don't even know why they started doing this, but they realized these guys are really, really hard to kill. Like nothing else God has made hard to kill, okay? And let me give you a couple things they've tried. First of all, they tried to asphyxiate it, take away all the oxygen. And I don't even know why they tried to do this. I think somehow they realized that in some water where everything else would die because there wasn't enough oxygen, these guys are just doing really well, so they thought, what if we take away all the oxygen? They found out in a vacuum where they suck all the air out of a jar, no air whatsoever, and they leave them in this bell jar with no oxygen for weeks. They look like they're dead. They let the oxygen back in, they just start swimming around again. They can live for weeks without any oxygen, like in outer space. And they thought, well, that's pretty cool. Wonder what else we can do. So they thought, in outer space, there's lots of irradiation. Let's just up the radiation rate. So they had 1,000 times more radiation than we have from like the sun. Because we get skin cancer because radiation from the sun mutates our skin cells and it starts to grow into cancer. Well, 1,000 times the background radiation, we'd all be dead within days or weeks. This guy didn't have any effect whatsoever. Generation after generation, didn't even bother him. Lots and lots of radiation. They thought, well, that's kind of cool too. I got another picture, like there's lots of different kind of dogs. There's lots of little variations of these pterogrades. Forgot about this one. They thought, well, we'll crush him. So they jacked the pressure up 1,000 times higher than atmospheric pressure. Literally, like if I had a pterograde right here and I took a hammer and I went whap and hit him with a hammer, you get a whole bunch of pressure real quick. He just flattened out and popped back up like a little balloon. And he was fine. Didn't even kill him. 1,000 times, more than 6 times greater than the deepest ocean on Earth. And he could withstand it perfectly fine. So here's his cousin. He's kind of cute too. 8 legs, just crawling around. So next we thought, well, let's just see if we can kill him by boiling him to death. So they dropped a bunch of them in boiling water, just boiling water, 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Cooled the water back down. They're just crawling around in there. Didn't kill them. You couldn't asphyxiate him. You couldn't irradiate him. You couldn't crush him. You couldn't boil him to death. So they thought, they like water. They live in water. We'll dehydrate them. So they found some of these in dry tombs. So they're just like a speck of dust, okay, completely dry. They think they've been there for hundreds of years. You added a drop of water, bloop, they came right back to life after being completely dried out for hundreds of years. Now I'll get to the point of this in a moment. One last thing. Well, if they can't boil them, maybe we'll try to freeze them to death. They took them down as close as they could get them to absolute zero. Negative 273 degrees centigrade. It's like negative 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And totally froze them. Now, if you freeze a human body, as soon as the water freezes, it expands because water expands when it freezes and it breaks open the cells and we die. That's why you can't just freeze a body and come back and thaw it out. That's why we get frostbite. Well, they froze this guy. When they heated him back up, he just started swimming around again. So God created a creature that you can't boil to death, you can't freeze to death, you can't asphyxiate, you can't crush, you can't irradiate, you can't take a, it's like, now, if this animal didn't have this ability before, when it was designed, and all of a sudden you freeze it, it wouldn't slowly adapt and develop that ability. It's like you would have to have hundreds of chemical changes to its programming in order to have its mechanism and the right chemicals and the right structure to do this. If its body wasn't designed that you could crush it flat and it would just bounce right back, it would die the first time you crushed it. It had to have all this stuff designed into it from the very beginning. Like God does these things so we will know He exists. And this is kind of my mantra when I go into schools and go do these presentations. God doesn't want any human being to think He exists. And He doesn't want any human being who's ever lived to just hope He exists. And He doesn't want any kid living thousands of years ago or today, or college professors or people working on the street to believe He exists. He wants us to know, to absolutely know, like we know nothing else in existence. There's no other possibility for why that animal could be here other than an unbelievably intelligent God made him, because there's nothing else like it. There's no other creature on earth that comes close to these kind of abilities, and He's just there. So we know, wow, the intelligence of the Creator. See, I think God wants us to have this awe of who He is. And part of that's looking at what He made and not forgetting that it couldn't have made itself. And it's like, oh, that's kind of neat, and moving on. Now, I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. Now we've got this little creature called a sea sapphire. Now if you hold your fingers about 1/4 of an inch apart, that's how big he is. Just 1/4 of an inch. Not very big. But they're in the ocean by the billions. And you don't even notice them because they're so small, and they'll kind of gather together in groups, and sometimes they'll spread out. But especially on coral reefs, they have these. And they're this beautiful blue color. That's why they're called sapphires. Now, the first creature, people, and I have to admit I do too. I grew up reading comic books in the 60s, the Marvel and the BC comic books, and Superman and Spider-Man and all these guys. And one of the comic book heroes that's really, really popular today, it's from a group of really popular movies called X-Men, and they all have these different superpowers. And the concept is they get this mutation, which is a random change to their DNA, and it happened to give them a superpower, and they've all got different powers. Well, one of them is basically invisible, okay? It's a really popular superpower. The Avengers have one of these guys, and shows up in Fantastic Four, and the Incredibles, one of the girls has his invisibility. Well, guess what? Marvel didn't invent invisibility. God did. This is a creature that can turn itself invisible. So you can literally see right through it as if it's not there. Now, scientists realized this, and they thought, how in the world does it do this? Well, this little sea sapphire, and you can't quite see it, but its body's covered with little scales, little microscopic scales, kind of like a butterfly. Butterfly, you know, it's iridescent. As it turns, the colors look different, and they're real shimmery. It's because all those scales reflect the light back at different angles just right. And they interfere, the colors interfere with other to give it the shimmery color. Well, the reason you see color is all the colors of a rainbow, and when they're all there, it looks white. But when I look at you, I see you have a green shirt, and yours is kind of a pastel, what color would you say you have? Peach. You have a peach color. Back here's blue. That's because the light comes down, it hits your shirt, it bounces back to my eye, and all of the colors of the spectrum are absorbed except for the wavelength that bounces off. And I'll see the blue, because the green and the yellow and the orange and every other color is absorbed. Well, with the sea sapphire, When light hits it, all the colors are absorbed except for blue, and the blue bounces back. But it goes through the first layer of scales, hits the second layer, and then bounces back to us. And it's exactly the distance between those two scales that all of them are absorbed except for the blue. But when that little creature turns, see if it's like straight in front of us like this, the light comes in and it bounces back, and the wavelength between the scales is exactly right, the spacing. But when it turns, now the light passes through, and it has to go a further distance before it hits the lower scale, and the blue gets absorbed too. Now the rest of its body is just filled with fluid, and it's very, very transparent. And those scales are very, very transparent. They just happen to absorb the light. So when it turns, every color of the spectrum gets absorbed. None of it bounces back. So the light from below it just comes right through it, and we can see the bottom of the ocean. Now I got a little movie I want to show you. And it's good. It's on a little loop. It's going to keep doing it. But the sea sapphire is just kind of floating there, and then it turns. And watch, you'll be able to see the bottom of the ocean as if it just suddenly became invisible. Watch this film. Okay, there he is, and he just turned. Watch it several times. See how you can see the bottom of the ocean right through him? He literally, for a fraction of a second, becomes invisible. God invented a creature that can turn invisible. It's as if he isn't there. The light goes right through him. You can see the bottom of the ocean coming up from the light scattering around it. Isn't that cool? Marvel didn't invent invisibility. But did you hear the design I was talking about? You have to have the scales that are transparent. They have to absorb everything, the right spectrum of light. They have to be spaced exactly the right distance apart. If anything isn't perfectly placed, perfectly designed, made of the perfect materials, and his body wasn't filled with transparent fluids, it wouldn't work. It would be useless. It would be pointless. It's designed beyond comprehension. And we didn't come up with it. God did. But I bet there's a useful purpose that you can figure out by looking at these kind of things. Okay, we're going to get a little bit bigger. Now we're going to look at honeybees. Now, people have been studying bees for decades. And clear back in the 1960s, we discovered that bees are really, really intelligent. When bees find a source of food, they will fly back to the hive, communicate with the other bees exactly where that food's at, and then a bunch of bees from the hive will go and find that food, that field of flowers. So Princeton University, and by the way, a bee has a brain the size of a grain of sand. Okay, our brains are thousands of times bigger. And really smart people like PhD people from Princeton University decided, let's see how fast bees can learn and communicate. So they developed this experiment. They took a bunch of bees from just one hive, and they radioactively marked them. So they knew when a bee showed up if it was from that hive, okay? They could have just pulled out an instrument and they immediately know it. So then they put a really rich source of nectar 150 feet away, and they waited there by this nectar source with their instruments for the first bee to show up from that hive. And it's going like beep, 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 beep. So they knew the first bee had showed up. Then they started their stopwatch. Click! And they wanted time. How long will it take that bee to go back, tell the other bees from their hive where this good food is, and then other bees will show up? And it took about 10 minutes. And they thought, that was really fast. Now, here's how bees communicate. And it took scientists like a long time to figure this out. See, when a bee finds a really good source of food, it goes back to the hive and it does a little dance. Okay, it takes its butt and it starts wiggling its butt and it's walking through the hive, okay? It's just wiggling its butt and walking along through the hive. And the other bees, they're intently watching it. Ooh, what's he doing, okay? Now, here's what he's doing. It took him a long time to figure this out. You see, it's doing a dance. And the direction of the dance is exactly a certain angle from the direction of the honeycombs in the hive. That angle is the same angle they have to fly from their hive depending on where the sun is at. 115 degrees, they look at the sun, they go 115 degrees, they fly that direction. The number of times he goes around in a circle tells them how far they have to fly. Now, here's the first problem. Students are shown this and they say, wow, look how evolution has allowed this animal to communicate. Now think about this. Here's a bee that finds a flower and wants to come back to the hive, flies back to the hive, first time this has ever happened, and he starts wiggling his butt and walking through the hive. Or the other bee is going to say, oh, wow, if I fly at that angle that far, I'll find the flowers. They're going to say, wow, George is having an epileptic fit. They're not going to have any clue what he's doing. You couldn't slowly learn a language. You either know what it means or you don't know what it means. And if you don't know what it means, that bee's wasting his energy. He's at an evolutionary disadvantage. It would make no sense. It couldn't slowly happen. See, God does this stuff so we'll know he exists. And students are just misled that it all made itself. So that's how they communicate. It only took 10 minutes. He flew back, did his dance, and more bees show up. So then the researchers move it 300 feet away. And they thought, well, maybe it'll take twice as long. Still only took 10 minutes. Well, that kind of surprised them. So they moved it 450 foot away. Oop, here we go, 450 foot away, just in the same direction. And first bee shows up, click their stopwatch, 10 minutes later, more bees are showing up. Wow, it doesn't seem to matter about distance at all. So they pick up their food and they carry it 600 feet away, except when they got there, a whole bunch of bees from the hive were buzzing around waiting for them to show up with the food. Isn't that cool? Little grain of sand-sized brain outsmarted the Princeton researchers. They had calculated the pattern, kept happening in the same direction. They calculated the distance. Well, it was 150 foot and then another 150 foot, and that must be going to happen again. And they were just waiting for them to show up with the food. Isn't that just, I just love that. It's like God is just astounding that these little insects could figure out a direction and a pattern and get there before it happened. Okay, now, a lot of what I try to do is equip folks like you. So when you're just going through life and you're talking to your friends, family, and kids, and you see things and you're watching shows, you just kind of have tools and conversation things to share with them that are fun and interesting. We don't need to pound people over the head with the gospel. We just need to go through life sharing truth and reality and what we know to be true and why. I've written 4 creation devotionals over about a 20-year period now. The latest one I did during COVID. By the way, the resources will be here for the next 3 nights. They arrived and we didn't realize the post office didn't deliver them to an empty when no one was at the church. So they're at the post office. You probably mentioned that this morning. But what I did over the last year, I decided all of the things you're seeing, by the way, are pages in these creation devotionals, all these animals, and there's just a small fraction of the number that are in them. I mean, there's one for each day of the year, so there's over 1,000 examples of how we can know God's behind every area of science and every animal and creature and floods and fossils and dinosaurs and astronomy and so on. But I started taking those little short one-page articles and turning them into little 2 to 3 minute videos. I call it Without a Doubt. We're not to have doubt about God. We're to have confidence in who God is and what he's done. And I'm going to show you one of them because I want to give you a feel for it. In the newest book, it's called Without Excuse. And that's from Romans 1. We're without excuse for believing in God as human beings. On the pages where I've done these little devotionals, filmed them, there's one of those little square QR codes. It's called Quick Read QR. You point your phone at it, up comes a 2-minute to 3-minute video. And I want to show you one of them. So I've got to start it. Hang on. Okay, here it comes.
The Hansons are hitting the road, and wherever they go, they'll be about 10 minutes from a hotel by Wyndham. The Morgans are soaking up the sun and the smiles. 10 minutes from a hotel.
You know, God told us to take dominion over creation in the book of Genesis. That means to study, understand, and control it. Now, why? Because we can learn so much from it. I mean, we can even learn from a slug. A slug, you say? Yeah. It turns out that there's a certain kind of slug that lives in northern Europe that slugs, when they move, they leave a slime trail. It's just kind of a sticky, gooey, watery thing. You can actually see their trail as they're crawling along. Well, scientists started to study this slug from Europe, And they realized their slime is very, very elastic, which means you can stretch it and it'll snap back, and very, very sticky. Now, for years, scientists have used things like super glue to bind up wounds. And they thought, it's a little toxic and it turns a little brittle. What we need is a really flexible glue that will stay sticky. And they discovered this slug slime and thought, these has the perfect characteristics for glue. Now, don't get too excited about, having some slug slime slapped onto your cut, because it takes a lot of slugs to form enough slime to fit the market. And, slug slime farms aren't exactly practical, because the slugs only exude this kind of slime when they're scared, because they don't want birds. Like if a bird's flying overhead, out comes the sticky slug slime glue. And if the bird comes and tries to pull the slug off the sidewalk, it's stuck to the sidewalk. So the only way to get the sticky glue is to scare the slugs. And slug slime farms aren't exactly practical. I mean, you set up a movie theater, you put all your slugs on the seats, and you show them movies of scary birds, and then you scrape the slug slime sticky glue off the seats. I mean, not exactly practical. So what do? They figured out how to synthesize it. And we now have the formula for sticky slug slime glue that is currently being used to seal up wounds. Isn't that cool? Because we figured out what God did first. So we can learn from creation, develop products that benefit us in a multitude of ways, even slug slime glue. What a slugger of an idea. So far I've filmed about 40 of those. They come out every couple weeks. If you go to my website, it's searchforthetruth.net, it's on the newsletters. The very first thing you'll see is the Without a Doubt devotionals. And if you sign up for them, they show up in your email. So it's just this fun way of connecting God to everything. And that's what we need to do. We need to reconnect God to everything people are seeing and hearing and thinking about. Now, I'm going to move on. Let's go back over. Got to find my cursor. Okay. We're going to now look at a superhero fish. Our animals are getting a little bit bigger. This is the Oopu fish. He's only found one place in the entire world. This fish lives nowhere else, and it's off the island of Hawaii, the big island of Hawaii. Now, he lives in the salt water, and he doesn't look like a superhero. He's only about that big. See, I'm getting a little bit bigger as I go along, bigger than the slug. He's not very colorful. I mean, he's got kind of like someone punched him and he has a black eye, but he does what no other fish in the world can do, and it's just so cool. I just love this. You see, like salmon, this fish has to lay its eggs in fresh water, but it lives its entire adult life in salt water. Now, the Pacific is a big ocean, and where it lives, it can't migrate for hundreds of miles. Where it lives on this island of Hawaii, there's only one source of fresh water, and it's at the top of this waterfall. Now, this is a 440-foot drop, a sheer cliff drop down into a freshwater pool, and then that water gets flushed out into the ocean. The Oopu fish lives out here. If it lays its eggs at the bottom of the waterfall, they're just going to get flushed out into the ocean. They're going to die. So what's it going to do? It's got to lay its eggs in fresh water. But there's no fresh water except at the top of the waterfall. Now, I always use this example when I'm doing these missions trips overseas with the kids, because especially in the Pacific area, they're familiar with fish and water and islands. And I'll ask them, how's it going to get to the top of the waterfall to lay its eggs? Because that's where it's got to lay the eggs, or there's no next generation. It goes extinct. And they've heard of different things, and they say, well, maybe it flies, because they've heard of flying fish. I mean, here's a flying fish. Looks like this, except they don't fly. They don't have wings. They just have fins that they stick out. They can jump out of the water maybe as much as 10 feet and glide for as much as 50 to 100 feet, and then they plop back down into the water. They can't flap them. They can't get 400 feet above the surface of the water. It does not work. So that's not how it happens. And usually one of the kids will say, well, maybe it climbs. And I say, well, like kind of like Spider-Man. And they'll laugh because, that can't happen. But I say, but you're getting closer, because there's another movie called Mission Impossible where the hero, Ethan Hunt, he has these suction cup gloves, and he literally climbs the tower in Dubai, which is like 140 stories high, and it's all glass, okay? God created a fish that has a suction cup underneath of it. Now, it doesn't have two little fins like most fish have. They're two completely perfectly fused fins that form a suction cup. So that fish goes and it slams itself against the wall, and then it shoves with its tail and sucks to the wall and shoves with its tail and sucks to the wall and shoves with its tail. And it takes it 2 or 3 days, but it will climb 440 foot to the top of that cliff, jump into the water, swim upstream, then lay its eggs. The legs will turn into little fishlings over a matter of weeks, and then they'll get flushed back down the waterfall and live the rest of their life in the ocean. And before the next generation, they have to climb back to the top of the waterfall. Now, isn't that cool? It's like, this is the awe of God. There's no other fish that does this. Now, people who believe in evolution, they'll just say, wow, look what evolution did. Well, suppose there's a little baby fish one day born with a suction cup. It's looking down and saying, Mama, what's this? So, I don't know. What do I do with it? I don't know. Well, how about if I go slam myself against a wall, wham, and then I shove myself to the top of the waterfall? It's not going to know what to do with it. It makes no sense. And if it needed that suction cup to survive before it could survive, it would have never survived long enough to have the suction cup. And it's just worthless if it doesn't need it, and if it doesn't need it, it never would have had it. And it's perfectly designed, along with the ability and the desire and the need to use it. All has to be there at once. So obvious. The creativity of God is beyond our comprehension. And why is it there? So we will know He exists. And it couldn't have made itself. Just one more example. Now, I talked about Michelangelo, the greatest human artist. Now I'm going to show you a little film of the greatest animal artist. It's called the Japanese pufferfish. This is what he looks like. And I've got a little video. Now, it's done by Planet Earth. Gorgeous series showcasing the marvels of creation. And Disney did another one. But it's narrated by David Edinburgh. You'll hear his voice. And if you have an English accent, that means for sure whatever you're saying must be true. But he's an avid evolutionist, and in every episode, dozens of times, it's talking about millions and billions of years of adaptation and evolutionary progress. It explains how all these creatures develop their abilities. So he's going to explain how this fish does what it does, and then we're going to talk about that at the end. But here's the Japanese pufferfish.
Unfortunately, this small Japanese pufferfish is dull, almost to the point of invisibility. But to compensate, he is probably nature's greatest artist. To grab a female's attention, he creates something that almost defies belief. His only tools are his fins. In his head, a plan of mathematical perfection. He plows the sand, breaking it up into the finest of particles. These shells aren't just rubbish to be removed. He uses them to decorate the bridges of his construction. He can't rest for more than a moment, but must work 24 hours a day for a week, or the current will destroy his creation. A final tidy up, and his masterpiece is complete.
Isn't that cool? Check it out when he gets a low angle. It's just really gorgeous.
Nowhere else in nature does an animal construct something as complex and perfect as this. If this doesn't get him noticed, nothing will.
Okay, now I'm going to stop it right there. That's the world's explanation for beauty in nature. It's there because it has some functional purpose. It gives the animal an advantage. See, what he's saying is that fish makes this beautiful sculpture so he can attract himself a babe. And then the babe will say, wow, this guy's a good artist. I better go get my eggs fertilized by him. And then they'll lay eggs. And therefore, that's why he makes this beautiful thing. Now, let me give you a quote from Charles Darwin, because Charles Darwin said little tiny random changes explain how all the information needed to make all the different creatures and animals and abilities and stuff developed over huge periods of time. And tomorrow night, we're going to talk about the dating methods in time. And I'm going to help you understand why that can't possibly be true. Because it's not good enough to just say, well, I believe God created recently. People aren't going to buy that. Very authoritative, they're shown why things must be really old. So we're going to talk about that. But this is a statement by Charles Darwin. He said, the sight of the feather in a peacock's tail whenever I gaze upon it makes me sick. Now here's a peacock. Okay, it is absolutely stunningly beautiful. But he couldn't explain beauty. Why would random changes make beauty? Now, people after Darwin started to say things are beautiful because they have a purpose and it gives them an advantage. So they just evolved. In other words, flowers are beautiful, so it'll attract insects. They're so colorful. Well, it turns out insects are colorblind. So that's not true. And they used to say, like that fish, male birds are really pretty so they can attract a female. Well, they decided to test it about 20 years ago. They did an experiment where they took a male peacock and they cut off all those beautiful iridescent eye areas. Okay, so just had a bunch of stalks sticking up without those beautiful decorations on the back of its tail. So this male peacock was pug ugly. Then they sent him out into a big field like this auditorium, and there's a whole bunch of male peacocks that have the beautiful feathers. And then there's this pug ugly guy that has all his beautiful feathers cut off. And then one after another, they sent in the females to see which male will she pick. Didn't make a bit of difference. It had nothing to do, the beauty had nothing to do with whether it would attract a female when they actually tested it. Beauty exists because it reflects the nature of our God, our Creator God. He's beautiful beyond comprehension. We just get a hint of his beauty when we feel it looking at a sunset, or the majesty of the night sky, or the beautiful variety of animals and flowers in nature. It's there for our enjoyment. No other animal enjoys it. They don't even comprehend it. It's all there for our benefit, to get a reflection of who he is. And evolution can't explain it. It just pretends to. When we test it, it turns out not to be true. Now, I got to zip ahead. I got about 3 more examples, and I've already went longer than I wanted to. The marine iguana, love this guy. My animals are getting bigger, okay? You know, the little puffer fish is now about this big. Now my sea iguana is about 4 foot long. This particular kind of iguana only lives on one island in the world. I love these animals. The animals that have these characteristics, there's like no pathway to them. They're just suddenly there. It's the only fish that can climb this waterfall. It's the only fish that can create this beautiful sculpture. It doesn't have like a great-grandfather. It was not quite as good of an artist. It just does it. And by the way, a human being couldn't even do what this fish does. If we were to try to shove sand around with our head, that fish is about 6 inches long and we're 6 foot tall. We'd have to create a perfect circular sculpture, a bigger diameter than the length of this room, without ever like looking up to see what we're doing. We couldn't even do what that fish does. God programmed it into it. Well, this guy lives on an island that's surrounded by sharks, okay? And he's like a great big juicy bratwurst sandwich to a shark. Like, yum. So, and he has to get fish to eat. To survive, he's got to go swimming in the ocean. He goes out in the ocean. Sharks have terrible eyesight, but they have really good hearing. And when he's out there in the ocean swimming around, because he's like 4 foot long, his heart is like that big, okay? And it's like it sounds like this. Boom, 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 boom. It's really, really distinctive under the water. The shark just tunes right in on it, and it goes and eats him because it can hear his heart. It sounds very different than anything else that's out there swimming. So Frank and George are there on the seashore, and Frank goes out and goes swimming, and a big shark goes and goes whomp, eats his brother. What's George going to do? It's like, oh man, I'm hungry. I got to go in there and get some food, but if I go and get food, I'm going to get eaten like my brother just got eaten. What am I going to do? So Frank turns his heart off, just shuts it down. It stops beating. Then he goes out and he swims, and he's just like swimming through the water. Sounds like anything else, swishing with the waves. You don't have that boom, 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 because his heart has been turned off. He can swim around for up to 20 minutes with no heartbeat. We die within 5 minutes with no heartbeat. Eats his fish, then he crawls back up on the shore. Oh, I forgot to evolve the ability to turn my heart back on. And he dies anyway. No. Once he's out of the water, he just starts his heart back up pumping. Now think of the thousands of engineering changes that would be needed in a biological body to function with no heartbeat. The blood still has to move. It still has to bring oxygen to his brain. His muscles still have to function. All this stuff still has to work without the blood moving around inside of his body. It's like he's been completely redesigned. And you couldn't just change one little thing. The muscles have to function different. The brain has to function different. The blood has to somehow function different. You have to have the ability to turn the heart on and off at will. All of it has to be programmed in from the moment he's born, or nothing's going to work. If just one thing changes, he dies. It's stunning when we study these animals what they can do with no ancestors. They were created by God for our awe and amazement. My favorite bird in the whole world is the Bar-Tailed Godwit, because it's not called the Bar-Tailed Evolution Wit. It's named after the one who made it. Again, this bird does what no other bird does, and it stunned scientists. It has the longest migration of any bird in the world. Okay, no bird migrates as far without stopping as this bird. In the winter, it lives in New Zealand. It's like we like to go to Florida. It lives in New Zealand in the winter, okay? And then in March, it flies up through Australia. In April and May, it makes its way to Japan. And by June, it lives in Alaska. And it stays in Alaska for June, July, and August. Nice and warm in Alaska. And Alaska is like a smorgasbord of food in the summer. The whales migrate there. It's like this huge bloom of plankton and krill. And it's just a smorgasbord for all sorts of animals living along the ocean in Alaska and the seashore. Well, this guy runs along the seashore and gathers food. He's got these long spindly legs. He's not like a seagull or a duck. that can swim underwater. He has no webbing on his feet. As a matter of fact, if he lands in the ocean, he can't take off again. He's just not designed to do that. So he has to fly nonstop all the way from Alaska back to New Zealand in September. It's a 7,000-mile nonstop flight. And it takes him 5 to 7 days, depending on how much wind there is. Now, scientists did a calculation. They know each time he flaps his wings, how much lift that gives him and how far that will propel him. And they know how much calories and energy it takes each time it flaps its wings. And they discovered it is absolutely impossible for this bird to fly that far without plunging into the ocean. It doesn't have enough fat. Can't happen. But it does happen. Well, that's weird. How does it do that? So they started studying this bird. Turns out the bird gorges itself for weeks before it takes off. It eats and eats and eats for like 2 weeks, okay? Like just never nonstop eating. Its weight increases 55% in those 2 weeks. So it's like a 200-pound man all of a sudden weighs 330 pounds. It's like the bird now is like the Goodyear blimp. So he's no longer streamlined, he's not very efficient at flying, and he still can't get far enough because he's too fat. Okay, so that doesn't work. So they're figuring out, well, he's got enough fat, but he doesn't fly very well because of all this weight. For the last week, after it eats and eats and eats, it starts eliminating all the water from the fat, and it turns it into like beef tallow, just a real concentrated kind of fat that's not real gushy and gooey. So the fat takes up less space, but he's still too big. So then, right before the bird takes off for the 7,000-mile flight, it shrivels up all of its internal organs. Its stomach becomes as flat as paper. Its intestines become flat as paper. Its liver, its kidneys, everything flattens out, and then the fat takes up all that extra space and it becomes streamlined again. And now it can fly 7,000 miles because it's a really neat aerodynamic design and it doesn't have as much air resistance. And it burns up every bit of that fat in order to get there. Isn't that cool? Think of all those changes. If all of them weren't in place, the very first time it took off to go there, it would plunge into the ocean and die and it would go extinct. Everything in order to do this all had to be in place the very first time it took off to get there. It could never have happened by evolution. It's impossible. Last example is this stuff that I didn't realize it was around so often in so many places. There are all of these organisms all over the earth that have the capability of creating light by mixing two chemicals together. Now, it's become very commonplace for us because about 40 years ago, we discovered out what are these chemicals that are allowing these animals to light up. And there's two of them. They're called luciferin and luciferase. And when you mix luciferin with luciferase, there's a chemical reaction that occurs and it gives off light. And that's what those light sticks are. And we now have them, see them 4th of July in parades and their bracelets and sticks and earrings and all over there. They're really common. They're really cheap nowadays. And they make different colors. And by the way, when you get different colored light sticks, the chemicals themselves are making different colors. They're different versions of that chemical. So evolutionists believe the ability for animals to make light has evolved about 30 different times through over billions of years, which even happening once is a stunning thing. By the way, did you notice those names? Luciferine, Luciferase. Remember one of the names given to Satan in Scripture? Lucifer, and he was called the angel of light because he was beautiful. He was like I think the most majestic abilities, intelligence, appearance of all the angels, to the point where he started to think he was as God. And that's the danger of all of us. And that's what he told Adam and Eve. You can be as God. And that's the downfall of us all. We think we can make up the rules. We think we can decide what's right and wrong. We think we can ignore what he's told us. But you see it in jellyfish. You even see it in little plankton. That is not light lighting up the ocean. All that blue are little tiny microorganisms that when the wave crashes, they give off they mix these two chemicals together and give off light. And the whole seashore lights up in blue. Isn't that cool? The jellyfish. You can walk down in the Amazon and you're walking along and there are mushrooms that glow green as you're walking along in the forest. Just green, glowing mushrooms. There's this scuttlefish, and I've got to find a movie of this. I haven't yet. But it makes light in different colors, and its whole back and its front snout, it will mix the different chemicals together, and it will form like a light show patterns that just streak across its back in this gorgeous, beautiful display of light. 30,000 feet down in the ocean where not a photon of light reaches, there are fish that have a light on a little stalk above them. And well, now this one is kind of useful. Because other fish, there's no other light. They're thinking, what's that light over there? There's a light. Well, that's interesting. There's a whomp. And this guy has a meal. It's used to attract a meal. But how did the world, it just evolve? A light bulb on a stalk. And then the one that we're most familiar with are lightning bugs. You kind of see those pretty much everywhere. And they're so common, we forget the awe of it all. And here's my wrap up. We started by talking about the issues of life and how that just can drive the awe out of all of us. And just, so the takeaway for tonight's session, as you're facing all these issues, is this. If God can put a light bulb on the butt of a bug, don't you think he can take care of your problems? Don't you think he can get you through them? Don't you think he can provide a solution? Don't you think he can give you the strength? Don't you think he can help you to help someone else who's going to have these problems later, and maybe there's a purpose in it all? Don't leave him out. Don't stop trusting him. And this is a scripture I love. God says, we are children of light and of day. We don't belong in darkness and night. So let us who live in the light, let us be clear-headed. And then protect our faith with ourselves with armor of faith and of love, and wear a confidence of salvation. So there's all those things I've talked about in this talk tonight. We are to have confidence. We're to know the truth, and light is something that allows other people to see the truth. So remember, the beauty is not there, and we're being deceived by the tour guides around us, but not just the people around us. And we're not to cover our light with a basket. We're to put it on a hilltop. Now, I'm sorry we don't have the resources. I'm going to challenge you guys. I sent way too much stuff out here, and I'm probably going to leave some of it because I'm going to be back in the Portland area in December for a conference. But I price all these beautiful full-color hardcover devotionals, and there's two other books that I call Censored Science and Brilliant, Made in the Image of God, like coffee table-style books. And all of my videos, like the lectures are 45 minutes long. There's 18 of them. There were only 12 the last time I was here. Now there's 18 of them. They're all priced like 10 items for $70. Think about this as you would a missionary who would come. And take 10 items, and over the next few weeks and months, look for ways to get them in other people's hands, because they're visual and they're interesting and they connect the world around us with God. And then that first step in leading people back to realizing that God isn't just creator, he's also savior. And the gospel message is in the back of almost every one of the devotionals. So each of these, and like those Rocks Cry Out sessions, they're like putting a pebble in someone's shoe. It's like seeing the Oopu Fish, or hearing about the bee outsmarting a scientist. It's not necessarily going to lead someone to Christ, but it's something they got to deal with because they're being taught it all made itself, and it's like that little pebble of truth that's going to work away, helping them understand, no, that can't be true. What else isn't true that I've been taught? Maybe there is something behind it all. Maybe I should know and we'll learn more about them. And by the time you get through one of these devotionals, it's like you filled their whole shoe with pebbles. So that without a doubt, little videos are one of the tools. By the way, I was here 4 years ago. You probably all signed up for my newsletter list, but if I don't hear from anybody and nobody orders any products and I don't have any contact or emails, After 3 years, I just quit sending out the newsletters. So re-sign up for my newsletter list if you want to stay on it, and grab the 2 that came out this year that are out there on the table. So the books will get here tomorrow, but that's something you can do as a tool to help continue to connect you and others to God. And that Rocks Crowd curriculum, they're lectures just like this, short, interesting, visual, filmed on location all over the country, not in front of a church. And if you watch them with your grandchildren and you're done with them, then send them to a friend that's in another church and say, this would make a great Sunday school class. All of a sudden, you personally have had part in impacting the thinking of dozens and dozens of other people. So these are tools to help with the truth. And as I said, it's kind of like filling someone's shoe with rocks by the time you do these things. So that's where I want to wrap up, just with kind of mentioning things that can help and how you can be part of making a difference in this area. So I hope you enjoyed tonight. Tomorrow night's about the age of the earth, and it's just as fun of a lecture. So, questions? Comments? And it's okay if you don't. We'll be here every night for the next 4 nights. Okay. Thank you for having me. I like being here.
That I love hearing about these different animals, and that's primarily what's in these devotionals. I thought I had some, but I think
You gave them all away. You did your part.
Did my part.
Yeah.
Gave them all away, and then with the Rocks Cry Out, I don't know. Did you mention this?
Yeah,
but
that's that video
was up to
series.
12.
Yeah, there's 12, but
So
now there's
you have
18.
6 more.
Yeah.
There's 18.
Yeah.
So looking forward to that. Let me have a couple guys grab offering plate for a love offering tonight, and looking forward to just the next few nights. Age of the Earth, that's an important topic.
It is. It's a very important topic.
That's an important topic, and even amongst Christianity, you know. Even there's these hybrid beliefs. I think the Pope and they're
We'll
coming
talk
up
about,
with these.
yeah, and that's part of what we're going to talk about tomorrow
you know,
night, how much compromise there is in
There's
that
a
area.
lot of compromise, and so you know, you can give on Easy Tithe as well. Just make sure you put it on the drop down under love offering.